So if this is the first time you visited this channel, I want to say welcome. This channel is all about helping you make spiritual progress in your life. No matter what's going on for you, we want you to use it as fuel for growth. Now, we're in a series at the moment looking at parts of the Bible which help us to understand God's creativity and how we can use that as a method for growth. So I want you to consider liking and subscribing to this channel, particularly if you find anything that is really helpful to you in your journey. But more importantly, I want you to consider passing this link on to anybody that you know who's really struggling in their own lives. So today we're going to be looking at Psalm 19, wonderful thing from the Old Testament. So let's make a start. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. So in the last session, we looked at Ephesians 2 and the way that Jesus destroys this wall of hostility between the Jews and the Gentiles. And of course, our idea is that He will also do the same thing within us, individually. And this session, we're going to look at Psalm 19, which we're basically going to get the same lesson. But one of the interesting things, of course, is that Psalm 19 is in the Old Testament. And I'm saying that, the Old Testament is external. The New Testament we can think of as internal, quite usefully, I believe. But of course, the Old Testament looks forward to the New Testament, so it should be backed up. Jesus is prophesied all through the Old Testament. So when we read the Old Testament here, Psalm 19, we should get a lot from it. So it's in several sections. So let's start with the first section. I'm reading from the NIV, by the way. So your version may say something slightly different, which I always find very interesting. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of His hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the end of the world. So this is fascinating to me, because it's basically saying, it's really echoing what Romans 1 verse 20 tells us, which is that we can know God, not just through His word and not just through His Son, but through His creation. In fact, Psalm 19 here is saying that it's crying out. So this is fascinating to me when you look at something like verse 2. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. You see, but the fact that they've got no words, the fact that it's basically, this is saying to us that you're not going to see this written down. In other words, you're not going to find it in the Bible. You're not going to find written instructions as to how to do this. But there is knowledge in there. Night after night they reveal knowledge. In other words, we can discover things that are not written down. When we look at the world, the way it's designed, we can see God's creativity and we can rejoice in that. And actually, it's fascinating. It says that there are no words. In other words, we're supposed to understand it in a different way because we know the Bible is the living word. So how do we understand it differently? This is what I'm getting at, is to say that once we look at the way the world is designed, then we can say we can use that design to learn from. It can teach us great things. So this is where we get the whole idea of inner discipling from, because we look at the design of discipling. We say, well, what did Jesus actually do? And when it says there are no words, you see, I think what that's telling us in Psalm 19 is that you won't find this in the Bible in written words. Does that make sense to you? So in other words, You won't find a step-by-step instruction about how to do this in word form, but the knowledge is there if you look for it, right? So the idea of discipling, this is what Jesus did for 3.5 years, and we can take that model, which is part of creativity, and we can reproduce it internally. And I think that is the great message that is hidden in plain sight within the Bible. So we're going to look at the next section now. So in the next section, we read from verse 4. In the heavens he has pitched a tent for the sun, which is like a bridegroom coming forth from his pavilion. Like a champion rejoicing to run his course, it rises at one end of the heavens and makes its circuit to the other. Nothing is hidden from its heat. Now, this isn't particularly relevant to my teaching today, but it is a fascinating thing to me that, like many things the Bible talks about, science only discovers hundreds or thousands of years later. And one of the things that you will sometimes hear is non-believers questioning the Bible and saying, well, you see, we used to think that the earth, the sun was revolving around the earth. Yes. And then we discovered, didn't we? Science discovered that actually it's the earth that revolves around the sun. And so this is wrong, right? But of course, science has now discovered that actually the sun has its own orbit. And that, in fact, it does make its circuit from one end of the universe to the other. And so the Bible's proved correct once again, even though science doesn't discover it for many years. But if we go on to the next section, from verse 7, the law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The ordinances of the Lord are sure and altogether righteous. They are more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the comb. By them your servant is warned. In keeping them there is great reward. And so just this idea of this surety, this idea that you can see the connection here between your joy, your feeling of well-being, and probably your physical health as well, in keeping the ordinances, the precepts, the laws, and the fear of God. Now we come to the section that fascinates me, particularly in terms of the message that I want to give and what I want to bring, where we go from verse 12 onwards, where he says, who can discern his errors? Forgive my hidden faults. Keep your servant also from willful sins. May they not rule over me. Then will I be blameless, innocent of great transgression. And then this wonderful ending which has been put in songs. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. So this idea of hidden faults and willful transgressions, how do we use this? How do we apply this in our approach? Well, of course we know that it's hard to see our own faults. We know this, right? So when you look at other people, seeing other people's faults is the easiest game in town. I mean, you don't even need any qualifications or training. If I asked you now what is wrong with your family, what's wrong with your friend or something, you'd be able to tell me pretty much straight away, and you'd often be right, of course. But when it comes to ourselves, then it's very difficult to see our own faults. Why? Well, the psychological reason, the common sense idea is that we're strongly biased. We're biased in favour of ourselves, and so we're much less likely to see our own faults. But we want to know how to use this idea based on this approach, based on the idea of inner discipling. How do we use it? Well, I want to come out with a therapeutic expression here. I want to talk about soft triggering and hard triggering. So I'll explain what these are, but first of all, let's understand. Make sure you understand what triggering is. Triggering is the way we describe a moment or an episode when your brain takes over, when it believes you to be threatened. Now, anytime it does that, we call that a triggered episode. If you want an example, I can give you one, probably the strongest example out of the Bible. It's Matthew 26, verse 50. Yeah, it's in the Garden of Gethsemane. You'll have to look it up for yourself if you want the context. But basically, Jesus replied, "Friend, do what you came for." He's being betrayed here. Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. Verse 51. With that, one of Jesus' companions, that's Peter, reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Verse 52. Put your sword back in its place, Jesus said to him, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. So, this is what we call hard triggering. In other words, if we see Jesus as your spirit and the disciples as your brain or your flesh, then we have the spirit here and the brain taking over, cutting off the ear. It's hard to mistake that one, right? And this is what we call hard triggering. In other words, it's unmistakable. We've all got hard triggers and soft triggers, right? In other words, when you're hard triggered, it's a complete shift. You can't mistake it. You feel very different, or you act very differently, or you speak very differently, or you think very differently, or sometimes all four. Whereas a soft triggering is much more difficult to spot. And why is this? Well, we'll go into this. In fact, I was just speaking to someone recently who was in a soft triggered state, and we had to work with that. So basically, we're soft triggered much more than we realise. I think that's the point I'm making here, is that because you don't recognise it, right? In other words, it's what Psalm 19 is calling hidden faults. You don't see them, right? And the reason for that is because they're very similar to yourself. And I'll explain this. This person, they were about to go to a church do, and they weren't feeling good. And we were working with that. And I said to them, who will you tell about this? And they said, no one. And I said, okay, do you realise that you're soft-triggered at the moment? And they said, no, I'm just being myself. And I said, okay, well, one of the IFS ideas, the 8 C's, would be connected, right? But you're refusing to connect. You're saying, I'm not going to share that with people. I'm not going to connect with people. And they said, yeah, but they can't do anything about it. They can't help me. They can't change it. And I said, okay, what you're doing now is you've learned to justify this disconnection. You've said, if they can't help me, then what's the point, right? Well, the point is connection, right? And when we are connected, then we are being more authentic. We're more truly Christ-minded in ourselves, okay? The fact that this person was disconnected and was justifying disconnection meant that they were soft-triggered, but of course they didn't realize it. And that's the point. If they would have known, then they could have done something about it. But once they realized, okay, now why? How did we help her to realize this? By understanding that whereas IFS will use these 8 C's, the Bible uses one word. It simply calls it peace, and it calls it peace beyond all understanding. It says, Paul says, I've learned to be content in all circumstances. In other words, that peace is very difficult to comprehend from a worldly perspective. Your circumstances may be terrible, but you are at peace. And that peace allows you to be connected. In other words, if she had been in her core state, her Christ-mindedness, she would not have minded being connected to people and saying, I'm having I'm feeling down today, I'm feeling sad today, flat today, whatever it was, she would have allowed that connection because she'd have been at peace with it. So what's the difference? Why do we have soft triggering and hard triggering? Well, it's just an extent of how we're triggered. And I want to say something else that might help you to really understand what the difference is. A soft triggering is much more likely to come from an older part. So let's say, for instance, you're 30 years old. You may have a part of you that is 28 or 27 or so. They're very similar to you in age. In other words, they're recently constructed and they're very similar to you. There's almost no difference between them and you. And so they're actually quite hard to spot. There are a few differences, and if you commit and practice, you will start to see the difference. Whereas a hard triggering is much more likely generally to come from a younger part. There's a good reason for this. It's because, number one, there's a huge age difference, and so you tend to recognize when they take over, they feel very different. Often as well, if they're very young, 5, 7, 9 years old, they have much more basic instincts, basic feelings, much stronger emotions. Their brain isn't fully formed. They're often very naive beliefs, and they have not much understanding of the world. And so the triggering tends to be very hard. Remember that parts, like the disciples, they're always, they're always certain about something, right? If you listen to, if you read the Gospels, and I urge you to get into this and to realize that you can internalize this whole discipling idea. When you read about the disciples, you see that they're always certain about something, right? I think that really gives you maybe a useful picture. I won't go on any further, but I want to apply this now to Psalm 19. And I want you to understand this idea of hidden faults, soft triggering, and willful transgressions, that's hard triggering. Well, that's when you know you're doing something wrong, as in Romans 7:20, you're doing what you do not want to do, but you do it anyway because you can't prevent yourself, you can't stop yourself, so that's willful. You know that it's happening, right? Soft triggering, you don't know. So there it is. I want you to consider reading and studying Psalm 19 and actually getting something from it maybe that I've not even mentioned. So we'll never get to the bottom of the Word of God, It's the living Word, so you can read it and get more from it. But there are several interesting points there that I think we can use. So until next time, be blessed. Bye for now.